Hello everyone, Professor Krzlik here. So I wanted to make a video about domestic politics built off of our OpenStax textbook that we've been working through. So when we think about politics, when people think about politics, they might think about elections. We've talked about elections, we've read about elections, political parties, or maybe even like high profile political conflicts within Washington, D.C., maybe what we see on TV. But for most Americans, politics is experienced most directly through domestic public policy, the laws, the programs, the regulations that shape our everyday lives. Domestic politics is where abstract debates about government power become concrete decisions about healthcare, education, taxes, policing, social welfare, and even economic opportunity and economic structure. So, domestic politics is fundamentally about how government responds to problems within society around us. So, these problems can involve economic inequality. Do governments decide or choose to address economic inequality? Public health. What is the role of the state within public health? Crime, environmental protection, or environmental deregulation. Education again, housing, social safety nets. Well, foreign policy, which we'll talk about later, deals with the outside world. Domestic policy focuses on how government governs at home within the borders of the state. So, at the center of domestic politics is a basic question: what role should government play in addressing social and economic problems? We know clearly Americans disagree deeply on this seemingly simple question, and those disagreements shape nearly every domestic policy debate that we live through. Public policy does not emerge automatically from public needs. Instead, it develops through political processes that include agenda setting, which we've talked about, many students have written about, debate, compromise, and implementation. Media coverage, public opinion, interest groups, elections, and political institutions all influence which problems are addressed and how those problems are addressed. So, one of the most important features of domestic politics is that government action always involves trade offs. Policies help some groups more than others. They require resources. Every policy requires some sort of resource, oftentimes through taxation or maybe borrowing. They can also create, and this is important, create unintended consequences. As a result, domestic policy debates are rarely about whether a problem exists, but about how to respond and who should bear the costs of those public policies. So, a central area of domestic politics is economic policy. Governments influence the economy through taxation, spending, regulation, and monetary policy, monetary coordination. Debates over taxes and spending reflect broader ideological differences. Some argue that government should play an active role in reducing inequality and providing economic security across the board. Others argue that too much government intervention distorts markets and discourages growth, thus slowing down the engine of the economy. These debates show up clearly in discussions of tax policy. Progressive tax systems, where higher earners pay a larger share, often are defended as promoting fairness and being able to fund more public goods. Opponents argue that higher taxes discourage investment and economic activity. These disagreements are not just technical. They reflect different views about fairness, responsibility, and again, the role of the state in people's lives. Another major domain of domestic policy is social policy, including programs like Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare, unemployment insurance, and food assistance. These programs are designed to provide a safety net against risks such as old age, illness, disability, or job losses that have no fault of people. It's just the cycle of the job market that maybe you lose your job. Should there be a safety net there to help you from that unintended situation? So here, supporters argue that social policies can promote stability, can reduce poverty, and reflect collective responsibilities of a society. Critics argue that these programs can be costly, inefficient, and create dependency. Healthcare policy is a particularly important and controversial issue, which we've all been living through these discussions, these debates, these ideas of how to have the best healthcare system possible. The United States spends more on healthcare than any other country. Yet outcomes and access do vary quite widely across the country. Debates over healthcare involve questions about how to control costs. How do you maximize access? What's that quality going to be like? And of course, the appropriate role of government in all of this versus private markets. Policy changes in this area are oftentimes generate intense political conflict because healthcare affects nearly everyone and involves powerful economic interests within society. Education policy, again, something that's important to all of us, is another key area of domestic politics. Decisions about funding, curriculum, testing, and access reflect broader debates about equality of opportunity, local control, and national standards. Because education is largely administered by states and local governments, federal involvement often raises federalism questions as well as ideological disagreements. Domestic politics also includes things like regulatory policy, where government sets rules for businesses and individuals. Environmental regulations, workplace safety standards, consumer protections, and financial regulations all fall within this category. Supporters argue that regulation protects the public from harm, protects the public from market failures. Opponents argue that excessive regulation, again, stifles innovations and stifles economic growth. We've seen this emerge quite a bit. Opponents to this government intervention really fall back on these two arguments. Excessive regulation stifles innovation and stifles economic growth, stops economic growth from occurring. So these regulatory debates often involve conflicts between long-term collective benefits and short-term economic costs. Environmental policy is a clear example of this. Efforts to address climate change or pollution regulation involve trade-offs between economic activity and environmental protection, as well as disagreements over scientific evidence and economic impacts, and intergenerational responsibility. When we hear these discussions, we hear about, well, what will happen if we regulate this? Will the economy suffer? What will the long-term impacts be? Versus, well, we don't want to leave a more polluted country for our children. All debates I'm sure you've heard. Even if you don't follow politics closely, you've at least heard these discussions and these debates from those around you. Domestic politics is also shaped by social and cultural issues such as civil rights, gender equality, immigration, criminal justice, and voting rights. These issues often involve deeply held values and identity, making compromise quite difficult at times. Policy debates in these areas are not just about efficiency or cost, but about fairness, morality, and national identity. Criminal justice policy illustrates how domestic politics evolves over time. For decades, policies emphasized punishment and incarceration. More recently, concerns about mass incarceration, racial disparities, and costs have led to debates about reform, policing practices, and alternatives to incarceration. These shifts reflect changes in public opinion, social movements, and political coalitions. Another important feature of domestic politics is the role of interest groups and organized actors. Business groups, labor unions, advocacy organizations, and professional associations all seek to influence policy outcomes. They provide information, mobilize supporters, and lobby policymakers. While interest group participation can improve representation and expertise, it also raises concerns about unequal influence and access, something that we think about and we talk about when we think about interest groups. Domestic politics outcomes are also shaped by institutional constraints. The separation of powers, federalism, and the structure of Congress all affect what policies are possible. Even where there is broad agreements that a problem exists, institutional barriers can slow or block policy change. This helps explain why domestic policy often develops incrementally, a slow change, rather than through sweeping reforms. So let's pause and think about that for a second. This helps explain why domestic policy often develops incrementally rather than through sweeping reforms. Small changes to the system, small, slow, sometimes frustrating changes to the system occur. And this can, again, frustrate people who want big sweeping reform, either on the left or the right. But the institutional constraints of the Constitution, of checks and balances, of federalism, mean changes occur slowly. So implementation is another critical and oftentimes overlooked part of domestic politics. Passing a law does not guarantee effective results. Policies must be administered by bureaucratic agencies, interpreted by courts, and accepted by the public. Gaps between policy design and real world outcomes are quite common, and they often shape future political debates. Public opinion plays a rather important role, as we can imagine, in domestic politics, but its influence is uneven. Policymakers are more responsive to issues that are visible, emotionally charged, and politically motivated. Technical or low salience issues often receive less attention, even when their long term consequences are quite important for society. So we know that domestic politics is dynamic. Policies that were once controversial can become widely accepted, while others lose support over time. Changes in demographics, economic conditions, technology, and social norms all influence which policies are politically viable. Ultimately, domestic politics is where democratic ideals confront practical governance. It reflects competing visions of justice, equality, freedom, and responsibility. It reveals how power operates, not just through elections, but through institutions, incentives, and implementation. Understanding domestic politics helps explain why government action oftentimes seems inconsistent, slow, or contested, and why policy debates rarely have simple answers. Domestic policy is not just about solving problems. It is about deciding whose problems matter most and what kind of society we want to live in. That makes domestic policies one of the most important and most challenging areas of American government. Thank you.